This is the same place in Timothy. Timothy is pastoring at Ephesus. So if you look at the book of Ephesians, you're liable to have same kind of abstract language, wouldn't you? So he's not talking about literal wine here. He's talking about keeping yourself pure in judgment. And you had to have a mixture. Remember mixed religion? You had to have a mixture to make something drunken a drunken elixir. And it had to have a certain amount of sugar, a certain amount of wine, a certain amount of yeast, a certain amount of it had to have an aging process at room temperature, lukewarm. And Jesus said, if you're lukewarm, I'll spew you out of my mouth, and told that to the church of Laodicea in the 3rd chapter of Revelation. But Timothy, when you're reading something in Timothy, you're reading the same characterization in the book of Ephesians, because Timothy was at Ephesus. So if you look at Ephesians, and you can think of this when you're thinking of a little wine for thy stomach's sake, look here. This is figurative language, because when you go over here to the same city that Paul was writing to when he wrote to Timothy at Ephesus, he was the pastor there. And 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are called the pastoral epistles. Those are instructions for a preacher that's going to be a pastor. And he's writing to Titus and Timothy. One's pastor at Crete, the other's pastor at Ephesus. But he says here in Ephesians, and whenever I think of that verse in the 5th chapter of 1 Timothy, I always think of this verse also. And both these books were written to Ephesus. But one was written to the preacher at Ephesus, and one was written to the Ephesian church. And the one who's written to the Ephesian church, he says something similar to the church that he says to Timothy. He says in verse 18 of chapter 5 of Ephesians, be not drunk with wine wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit. Well, excess is the word asotia, A-S-O-T-I-A. It's constructed by the word sozo, which is the word saved, and the alpha privative. It means don't act unsaved. And don't have a mixed religion that makes you spiritually drunk. Do you know that when you get into studying the word drunken throughout Scripture, the majority of the time it's talking about spiritual drunkenness? Now God don't put His approval. I went through and looked up all the verses one time, and I said, gosh, majority of these are talking about being spiritually drunk. Well, if God's talking about spiritual drunkenness, that would be figurative language, wouldn't it? So when you're writing to the same church, now go back over here. God didn't wander off in space when He's talking about spiritual things. Say, oh, let me stop and tell you something for a minute here. Watch how much you drank. You know what He's saying. Then when you get back over here to 1 Peter 4 and verse 7, he doesn't just go somewhere off cockeyed. Let's go off here and talk about something I wasn't talking about. You can believe that every one of these books that God had these apostles write, they're all following an exact pattern all the way down through them. And never pay attention where the chapter headings change, and don't pay attention where they... Don't even pay attention to chapter and verse. You know I very seldom look at chapter and verse. I only remember chapter and verse because I've said it so many times. But I don't remember a lot of verses. I'm not even interested in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I know exactly where it is in my Bible. I can give me a piece of paper and point exactly where it is on the Bible. I'm not even paying to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. My intent is on what does that say. I don't even care what number it is. I'll say chapter so-and-so. It's because I don't know which verse it is, but I know exactly where it is on the page. It's right there. So our interest needs to be in what the Scripture says and not in showing off. Now, I'll say chapter and verse whenever I remember it, but I don't always know it because I'm not even interested. I'm sorry, but that wasn't in the text. That wasn't in the text. Chapter 5. That wasn't in the text either. They had a scroll. They just rolled it up and then they rolled it out. But they had read it so much they knew where it was. They said, oh, that's over here in Paul's writings. Okay, here it is. They wrote it out. They didn't have a chapter and verse. That's just for our sake so we can find it. Now, so he says, but the end of all things is at hand. Be ye therefore sober and watch unto prayer above all things. Have fervent charity. Charity is the completion. Charity is the telos. Charity of verse 8 is the telos of verse 7, which is the word end. It has nothing to do with preterism. Did I finally get that over to you? And the main reason we know that's what it is because we've looked at it. We've looked at it in Colossians. In Colossians, and he's talking about how we ought to live as believers. Colossians, the 3rd chapter. In Colossians, the 3rd chapter, he's talking about put on or be clothed with holy, beloved, bowels of mercy, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness. In verse 12, long-suffering, forbearing one another, forgiving one another. All the things that we should be doing. And if any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. He's saying be mature, isn't he? And then he tells you what the maturity is or what the end is. And above all these things, put on charity, which is the bond of perfectness, teleates. It's the bond of telos. It makes you complete. So when the word says end, in 1 Peter 4 and 7, it's the same, it's a derivative of the same word as perfectness here, which is teleates, T-E-L-E-I-O-T-E-S. Maturity. Maturity in the believer is walking in the commandments of God. That's what charity is. But it's agape. And you don't walk in God's agape all of a sudden, do you? Nope. And we've also said over here in 1 John. In 1 John, I'm putting this in here again. I'm not doing it so much for you. I'm doing it for the TV. I'm going to play this on TV so these preterists can see this. You guys, I've never heard such ignorance. Now here's the perfect. Here's the perfect. Well, what did I say? Oh, 1 John. 1 John. Yeah, 1 John 5. 1 John 4. And he says, and he talks about love or agape all through here. In verse 15, whosoever shall confess that Jesus is the Son of God, God dwelleth in him, and he in God. But confess, homologeo, doesn't mean merely to say with your lips. It means to do. Homologeo. That's the same word as profess in Titus 1:16. Some men profess that they know God, but in works they deny him, or walking in the commandments of God they deny him. In maturity they deny him. They won't rise up and walk in truth. And then he goes on to say, and we have known and believed the agape, which is the perfect, that God hath to us. God is agape, or God is within us, walking in his commandments. God is in us. When he loves us, he causes us to walk in his commandments. 2 John 6, this is love, this is agape.